Yes.
Thank you. I just have a handful of matters. First of all, do you have any familiarity with open records as opposed to closed records in hospitals? Open records where doctors could simply go and get the medical records, as opposed to closed records where medical record officers provided them to clinicians. Is that something that you've ever come across?
No. I think I'm sure clinicians occasionally would go into the medical records department and retrieve a note, some records, simply because they were frustrated they haven't arrived. I'm sure they could go and do it, but most of it was done by the administrative machinery that delivered the notes to the right place at the right time.
And are you aware of a situation where very old medical records have been sent to local public archives or libraries? Have you ever come across that?
No. I know one or two cases where old records have gone to the Wellcome Trust, which has got a history department, because they were seen of historical interest. So some of them could have gone there. But of course, nowadays, with data protection, it's not so easy just to transfer notes where you want them. I can't think in the past any public repository. They weren't seen as important, I think, in the past. They weren't seen as, they were simply the shorthand for the clinician to recall which patients they'd seen last. So for a lot of people, those records were not seen as important.
And are you aware of anything relating to Scottish trusts using microfiche records?
I'm sorry, I don't know anything.
Moving forwards to more modern day times, do you have any awareness of some hospitals who are only now moving to electronic records?
I'm afraid I don't know the national picture. I would imagine every hospital will have some degree. The thing is, it isn't a one-off for everything. There will be phases of it. As I said before, in general practice, it started off with prescriptions. That was automated, and then other things were added. In the same way, appointment systems for hospitals will be digitised now, but some of the record will not be digitised. So it will vary, and I can imagine different hospitals will have different rates, and some will be wholly digitised, whereas others will still be using legacy systems in some way.
You spoke about particular issues arising now where people have lifelong chronic conditions, and particularly where they are multifaceted. Do you think that haemophilia is a good example of a condition where it's lifelong and therefore whole life records should be kept?
Yes, indeed. That's why that curious thing that after 8 years or 10 years after treatment, the record should be disposed of doesn't make sense, because you could be getting treatment, but you could be getting it at home, but you're still getting treatment. So the fact the hospital isn't delivering the treatment doesn't mean the record should go. So I would have thought nowadays, with the recognition of long-term conditions, which, as I said, are very, very common, and multiple long-term conditions are very, very common, there's no reason to dispose of records till well after the patient has died, and then only on the grounds that this is data protection. It's somehow the patient's personal data, should that be released into the public domain, and I think there are questions around that.
And leading on from that, particularly in the context of those with hepatitis B, hepatitis C and or HIV, would that add to the picture of needing lifelong records?
Well, yes, absolutely. Though maybe at the time some of these diagnoses were made, they perhaps didn't realise for example, with hepatitis C, some of the consequences of hepatitis C might take decades to emerge. And at the time, when hepatitis C was diagnosed, a lot of clinicians wouldn't have been aware of that. So they might not have seen that these needed keeping for long-term reasons. But nowadays, we now know that all of those hepatitis viruses and HIV have got long-term consequences for the patient, or may have long-term consequences for the patient, and therefore those records should be of value right away through the patient's life.
And in today's world, if somebody goes to a different hospital and provides their patient number, can the clinicians at that different hospital access records using that patient number?
Yes, they can request the other hospital, please send over Tom Jones's records. Whether they will get that quickly, whether it will be acted upon is another matter. I mean, sometimes it happens. especially if the consultant is very insistent that this record is very important for the ongoing care of the patient. And sometimes it'll go to a record department or whatever, where it's, so somebody's got to act on that request, whether it's in a physical folder or it's a digital readout. They've then got to transfer that digital readout somehow to the new hospital. So it isn't straightforward, though it is possible.
In a similar vein, if a patient's away from home and requires emergency treatment at a different trust, how can the treating trust ascertain special treatment regimes or anything like that on an emergency basis?
That's more difficult. What they could do, and they sometimes would do, they would phone the consultant who's giving the care at the home hospital and ask them to look up on the digital record what sort of therapy is this patient getting at the moment, or what are the problems this patient's got. So that there can be that, but it requires a personal sort of message, email, phone call, whatever, to get that. It isn't as if the system allows it. It's got to be a personal intervention.
And when there is access to an electronic medical record, is there different access for, say, consultants compared to nurses, compared to receptionists? Or is access to the electronic record open to everyone?
It tends to be open. If you've got access to it, it's open, which is an issue for who can see what's in it. But as I said, because it's moving much more towards a shared record, both shared within the healthcare team, which includes a lot of people nowadays, as well as with the patients, then we accept that it is a much more open record.
And finally, when you describe situations where the GP can see a hospital record, were you meaning geographically that's been set up, or
Yes.
between particular trusts or specialities?
Yeah, it's within a local, within a locality. So one hospital will have liaised with its local GPs and set up that arrangement. So it won't be universal in the UK.
Those are the questions I've been asked to raise, sir.
Yes, well, a handful of questions, just following on from that last. A little while ago, there was a talk of a mega computer linking all the hospitals in the NHS, and I think some investment was made into achieving that, and it came to nothing very much, I think. Mm-hmm. What happened to it?
I think that was probably Connecting for Health, I think was the name of that initiative. And with, as usual, big IT projects, they often fail. And I think they fail for a number of reasons, partly the hardware, getting all those computers to talk to each other and the software to manage that is difficult, the technical problems around it. But also there's the ways of doing things which different hospitals and different consultants have evolved over time. And so they find it very difficult to adapt to a completely new case record. They haven't seen that before. They're used to the one they see every day, and to impose a different one on different hospitals is rather difficult, especially at some specialty hospitals. If you've got a specialty neurology hospital in London, Queen Square, for example, or a maternity hospital like Queen Charlotte's, they will have different needs in terms of their records. So it's very difficult to get a one-size-fits-all for medical records. I think that's the problem. So I'm sure there will be further attempts, but I'm not sure that the grand designs ever work in these circumstances.
You mentioned earlier the great advantage which there had been, at least in antenatal care, when patients had their own records. They took their records with them rather than left them at the hospital. And that, I suspect, was probably talking about paper records rather than electronic records. What, if any, difficulties do you see, or advantages do you see, in the patient having a digital passport which they can take with them?
What an interesting thought. Maybe that could be in the future, that they could have that. I mean, at the moment they can carry some. There are now apps which enable you to carry some health records with you, but the whole idea that you carry your own record with you, that I guess the hospital will require some access to that record simply because when the consultant sees a patient either in the hospital or in outpatient, they usually write a letter to the GP to inform, because the GP in the British system, the GP is responsible for your ongoing care, and they sort of lend the patient to the hospital for specific periods of care, and then they're meant to return them to the GP. So there's lots of letters going to the GP saying, I have seen your patient, and this is what I want from them. So these letters have got to be written, and they've got to be somehow incorporated in the record, and they're usually written after you've seen the patient, not immediately at the same time. So there's that difficulty. And there's also the difficulty of when you get results of tests, which might be days or even weeks after you've organised the test, then how would that get filed in the patient's app or whatever it was? Maybe technically it can be solved, but that, from the history of obstetric records, that is a solution, at least to losing records, that the patients would look after them much, much better, I'm sure.
It doesn't have to be, of course, one person looking after the same records, because data of its nature is not confined to a document any longer. If it's data online, then the data can be the same information can be given from a number of different sources.
Absolutely. Yes, as long as you can manage the security, because obviously it's much more sensitive data, and as long as you can manage the security of access and things. But I guess some of the big social media firms have managed that, they with passwords and things, to enable you to protect your own data. But it is a thought for the future.
I mean, it may be a very simple example, and it may not help with the totality of a patient record. But in the recent COVID outbreaks and people travelling abroad, there is an app which certainly in personal experience downloads it pretty well instantly every inoculation in respect of COVID, wherever and wherever it arises, simply by using the NHS number.
Yes.
But,
so I've used it too, you're absolutely right. So maybe that system could be extended over time. But if it is extended, I would think it would be better to do it incrementally rather than the sort of big bangs, which don't seem to work. But an incremental movement towards online records would solve a lot of problems, I think.
Well, if it would, then what I would ask you to do is give it some thought before we meet you again in the near future, just to see if there are any problems with it. Because the last thing anyone wants to do is recommend something which actually turns out to be the wrong choice.
Yeah. No, it's an interesting idea. Thank you.
The next question is to do with other sets of statistics which are available electronically. The hospital episode statistics, HES, contain quite a bit of information about patient visits to hospital, don't they?
Mm-hmm, yes.
And is that a system which operates in the same way across all the hospitals, at least in England and Wales?
Yes, it is.
So it may not be entirely accurate because it may depend upon the input. How does that link up with patient records?
Well, it's a slightly different system. So the hospital's got to give a return to the Department of Health about all its activity. So it will be the main activity, which will be coded, so they will say that this patient had this diagnosis, we're in for so many days, and so on. But it doesn't have details about the care they received. For example, which drugs they received, or which operations they received, might not be all covered in that. So it's rather schematic. But where it is useful is that the GP record, which in its entirety can now be collected online. As I said, I have used it. These are pseudonymized records, so I have no idea who these patients are. But I can collect those data, and now through record linkage, you can get the linkage to the hospital record as well, to HES as well. So I can see for all those patients, which of those patients who had that cancer went into hospital for an operation for that cancer. So this linkage can now be done. It's a bit time consuming, and it costs the researchers like myself some money to do it, but it can be done. But a lot of that record linkage, of course, works in all sorts of other ways. Nowadays, we are getting more and more linkages with different data sets, so we can do research on them. But of course, there are ethical issues about you've got to maintain confidentiality and so on all the way through. And each time you pull in another linkage, it increases the risk of being able to identify individual patients, which you can't do, obviously.
Yes, and presumably you may want someone's consent if their data is going to be subject to research.
Yeah.
The next question is about culling, where you made a powerful case for saying, well, records simply can get too big for you to find anything quickly that may be meaningful, and you don't have very long necessarily in a diagnostic interview at a GP's surgery. So culling might be an answer. Is it a problem with culling that it is looking for someone to identify a particular condition, whereas in practice quite often some conditions the GP hasn't really got a firm idea, or the hospital clinician hasn't got a firm idea what the diagnosis actually is. He knows that it's what symptoms the patient's complaining about, and in a sense those symptoms are more fully described the more documents there are in the bundle.
Yeah, yeah.
So how does it work? If you cull, you may lose all that valuable history.
One of the more common diagnoses in general practice, certainly these days, is medically unexplained symptoms, which are, by definition, nobody quite understands what they are. The patient's still got the symptoms, they've got the pain, they've got whatever it is, but the doctor can't find anything wrong in a physical sense. And often these patients go through all sorts of investigations, all sorts of journeys through the NHS trying to sort them out. And I agree, a lot of that information is of importance. But it depends who does the culling. If that's left to the trainee GP or the junior doctor in the hospital, will they appreciate that those little telltale signals one day will all add up to something significant? So the danger is that you will cull out, you will prune out the wrong things. So it's a cost and benefits. If you can cull it down and you can see a much clearer picture of the patient's problems, that's great for clinical care. But at the same time, you might lose some of these essential flags, which will tell you what's really wrong with the patient.
Yes. I suppose it wouldn't really, or would it be a job for the medical records officer? They'd have to be pretty experienced clinically. What sort of qualifications, what interests somebody in a career in medical records? What's the career structure? Is there one?
I don't know, but obviously they don't exist anymore in the same way. Now you'll have the IT specialist who's running the show. But I guess it's the same sort of skills as a librarian. It's filing and retrieving documents on a massive scale, in a systematic, hopefully systematic, massive scale. So it's a sort of whatever skills you need to be a librarian, I suppose. I'm not sure what they would be. But
well, I suppose you might be interested in reading books. I'm not sure the same necessarily applies to other people's medical records.
No.
Yes. I think that's all the questions which I have. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll obviously be hearing from Professor Armstrong again in early October, sir.
Yes, we shall. We do offer all our witnesses, and therefore this is no exception, the chance to say something if they want at this stage. You feel free, you don't have to. But if there is something you want to tell us about what you've been talking about or anything else that crosses your mind, please do so.
No, I don't think I've got anything to add to what I've said. Thank you.
Well, just let me thank you very much indeed. You've given us a great foretaste of what is to come, and you're such an enthusiast for your subject. It gets infectious. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Ms. Fraser-Butler.
Tomorrow we will be hearing from Susan Douglas, followed by a presentation on the destruction and retention of medical records.
Yes. So Susan Douglas, the journalist from the the Mail on, who read the Mail on Sunday article back in 1983.
Indeed.
Thank you.